to understand, I think, short, medium, and long term, how to understand what we see online, how to like take it in and evaluate it. Sourcing is a big thing. You don't have to be an academic obsessed with footnotes to want to know that when somebody says something and they offer up evidence and they use the magic of the World Wide Web to share out a link to it, that you want to be able to follow that link and see what that person saw and have a sense that what you're seeing is in fact what was placed there, and then evaluate the source at that link. And I was shocked now nearly a decade ago when we did our first kind of test of link and reference rot, how many links that are embedded in documents meant to endure for the ages, how many are still there, and to find that there's kind of Swiss cheese, that half of all links in Supreme Court opinions of the United States are dead, and some of them are changed. One of them makes fun of the justices, and you can't go back so easily and change the opinion to direct it elsewhere. And we found that 3/4 of the links in the Harvard Law Review, a legal journal, no longer function. We found that in the New York Times, there were, I think, a quarter of all deep links in the New York Times, which is to say links that aren't just to a domain name, but go somewhere specific on the web. A quarter of those have rotted, and half of all articles in the New York Times contain at least one rotted link. And I think those are to me pretty disturbing statistics, but ones that directly connect to the project of dealing with disinformation. Because if you can't keep something under the microscope at time equals 0 and know that it's going to be there at time equals a year later or a month later, it's really hard to have a handle on things. And it's not as if there's some great gold copy in a library somewhere. The libraries are storing stuff that may or may not map to what everybody else is using to have debates and to arrive at truth. And finally, I find myself worried that as we shift to the digital form for stuff meant to endure, like ebooks, the ebook is now the canonical edition more than some physical book somewhere for a given book. There are no processes in place for a role like that played by libraries, where if somebody came marching in the library and demanded a book off the shelf so they could rip out page 34 because they think it's inaccurate, the library would not take well to that. There's no commensurate institution in the digital space. And I was shocked to find that for Amazon Kindle, for example, they don't even keep track of the changes that are made by choice by the author, by demand by third party. Often those two merge because the author might under duress choose to ask to change something because they got a threatening letter. These are all ways in which information has gotten a little too protean, that there appear to be there's no adult supervision keeping track of this and figuring out a way to freeze humanity's knowledge as it's generated in ways that we can lean upon it and draw upon it. Well, it's certainly strange to have a technology that is at once, on the one hand, so accessible and easy and free and reliable and instant until it isn't. And it's just really hard for any given participant in the space, ones with all good faith, whether on the supply side with a message or something they're conveying, or on the demand side with people who want to get to stuff and in turn may link it out to others. Why wouldn't you use what's right in front of you? It's very much the kind of just-in-time supply chain that works great until it doesn't. And I think, Jason, your stories are extremely compelling of examples of the collection and preservation of what might seem to be ephemera at one moment and turn out to be significant cultural memory later, whether it's Kmart Blue Plate special menus or Grateful Dead recordings. I complement worries about how to preserve that with kind of structural, systemic, civic worries about the fact that whatever you're leaning on, oh, I remember there was that program that said X, I want to go back and find it. You just never know if it's still going to be there, or if it is there, if it has been elided in some form under consistent and structural pressure. Once there's an opportunity to elide it, there will be people and institutions that want to see the record elided.
Right.
And we have not had a chance to confront that because of the raw physics of the way that knowledge used to be produced, which was on 20-pound acid-free paper in the millions of copies that got distributed all around, with institutions who like train the people within the institutions, I'm talking about libraries, of course, to, you know, not let the stuff get mutilated or lost. And there's just none of that layer here. So kind of back to disinformation, I even worry that the artifact of the URL, here's a link to the thing, and if only we can preserve that link, we're good. Just have to remember where it was and what it said. That's vanishing. We're in a world of apps that don't have a link. You're kind of screenshotting as best you can, or screen recording what you see and then shoving it in a folder somewhere and hoping you can find it later. It's an extremely difficult way to have any process of reflection, of education, and of dialogue around artifacts that are messages, instead of just, here's what I'm thinking in this moment, happen. And I think if you look at it that way, maybe no surprise that it's harder and harder as a society to follow the thread of an argument, even if all the parties are in good faith, like trying to figure something out together. There's no CEO of the internet. There's no company that makes internet. There's no toll-free number to call that is the internet when things don't work. And it's a flavor of technologies that in the past I've in contrast with their counterparts called either generative or non-generative technologies. You might also think of them as civic or non-civic, or more recently, owned and unowned. There are technologies that no one entity owns, and I mean that in a very specific sense. There's nobody particularly formally credentialed that is in charge of producing and tending to the technology. So, you know, Sony makes VCRs, or more recently, Sony makes, you know, clocks, or any, you know, laptops. And they respond to market pressures and maybe to regulatory pressures, so that the batteries in the laptops don't overheat and that they have the features that people want. But if you have a problem with your Sony laptop, you know whom to call. And most of the technologies, certainly prior to the internet, that we encountered day by day, technologies at least that were things you got at stores, were owned technologies. And that meant that we collectively knew whom to hold responsible when they went wrong, or if we wanted to have some mandate to shape them, a baby's crib, anything, you could do that, in that case, for safety. Unowned technologies are much more emergent, and they have the capacity to surprise us, to evolve in strange directions. The internet is a canonical example of that. And some of the things that Jason was talking about are within the internet examples of that, like internet relay chat, or news groups, or email. There's no CEO of email. There is Gmail, and there's Yahoo Mail, and there's your university's email, or there's Atlantic.com, but there's no overall email. It's a set of protocols which are just agreements among all the people who code email programs that say this is how email will work. And there's an internet engineering task force that sounds awfully official, but kind of like Brewster's Internet Archive. It's just some people who got together and said, let's design protocols for an experimental network. And they might even say in 2022 that the jury is still out on these protocols, but they have no enforcement powers. They can't tell you if you're Cisco building routers, or if you're somebody writing an email program, or Zoom, you have to use them. It's just, if you don't, you might find it difficult to have your program work because everybody else appears to be using them. That's, once they're established, they have this amazing inertial force that is de facto kind of the force of law, even though there's no constabulatory mechanism for keeping people on top of it. And when something is therefore a collective hallucination like that, we say there's an internet because there are all common protocols we use, but there's no one actually individually responsible, legally or in exercise of power, for making them. Not to say that everybody equally can do it, but it's very different from the normal technologies that many of us grew up with. There are all sorts of other dynamics and ones that implicate all of the issues this conference is about. We are so lucky that I think the internet came about and it produced such astonishing things like the web itself, not produced by Web Inc., but by a wonderful guy named Tim Berners-Lee, who, like, in his off hours at a particle accelerator, designed a web server and a web client and the protocols for same and said, here, world, it's all yours. And the world uses it. So that's what I meant by collective hallucination. It's wonderful. It's also means you can end up in ruts that are really hard to fix, even if everybody sees how it could be better or there's a real problem. And establishing trails when things change or evaporate. When you look at this now library that we are all relying on, it's not some niche thing. And you're like, yeah, it's actually a distributed library. It's called what people have in their houses on their shelves. And they kind of voluntarily just contribute to an index. And if you need a book, you just find out what neighbor might give it to you. And good luck. Like, that starts to sound a little jerry-rigged for society's knowledge. We can't be what they call completionists about what we save. Should you be making judgments about what you save? And I think the answer is surely yes. I'm supportive of the idea of having those who are in a position, credentialed as curators, making those judgments, which of course are judgments that get made all the time when a library has a finite budget for its books, or a museum for artifacts, or even just for space in a humidity controlled room for what gets put in the ark for later and what doesn't. There's surely a role for that. And it might mean saving stuff that is disinformation, precisely so you have saved that too. And at the same time, there is an opportunity to have people saving on the demand side in some collective form. We started something called perma.cc or perma.link around 2015, which allows anybody that is about to put a link into something they're doing, a newspaper article, a judicial opinion, a piece of academic work, anything kind of meant for the ages, and submit it to a consortium of over 200 libraries, including the Internet Archive, which then take a snapshot of what's there and return a permalink that can then be placed alongside the original link. And at that point, the person writing the document that has the link in it is the curator, is the person who is absolutely not able to be a completionist. They're only putting one link in, but they are contributing to a distributed set of decisions about what's worth saving. And it might well mean that everybody pointing to US government documents, all right, those are going to get saved, have permalinks, and you're about to go to the, whatever it might be, nih.gov to get that medical article. And oops, there's a government shutdown. And the last time we had a government shutdown, all US government sites were down. They returned 404 errors on purpose, on the presumption, I guess, that the hamsters couldn't be paid to run on the wheels to power the servers. So you could, with the permalink, still get to that stuff if what's being pointed to is gone. And those choices are being curated not centrally by librarians or others, but by each individual person as they are putting together documents and choosing to source stuff.